Share the screen. Yeah.
So we're going to open up the floor. Okay, I think it should work. So we're going to open up the floor now. We have half an hour allocated to this, and then Catalina will wrap up the day for us. So really, this is now an open space for any of the visitors, speakers, anyone to ask a question, to make a comment, to share a reflection, or any of the speakers to maybe add a piece that maybe they feel they didn't cover or merge afterwards. So really, it's your floor now for the next 30 minutes.
Jenna, if I could, I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, please go for it.
Okay, great. Yeah, so what's underlying this gathering, of course, is in part what Soraya was noting in terms of the importance of comparison, and that's important. The importance of comparison for whom, of course, is the follow-up question and thinking through for ourselves as educators and students or action practitioners. Comparison is important, but also in terms of looking at where the seats of power exist in terms of affecting reforms on the higher scales, as well as collaborating at more local scales is critical. So I think it would be beneficial for us as practitioners, as folks who are interested in operationalizing change, to be thinking through where do we hit first? How do we begin to do this? And maybe we're doing it already, in effect, but not very in a very collaborative form. Sometimes we're collaborative, but comparison is only helpful in the extent to which we take away from that comparison and we say, okay, well, this is happening, and we're able through comparison to identify a common source that requires change, or we're able to identify different sources that require change. So I just think it's worth perhaps thinking through the issue of comparison in practice. For me, I'm looking at how do water utilities benchmark themselves, and why does that matter for creating better water affordability for folks on the ground? And that's both an international question, but it's also a very localized question. So just to give an example of how I think about comparison.
That's really helpful. I think, this question of comparison for whom, the question of where do we start. Does any of the speakers want to maybe jump in on that, or on the floor?
No obligation. It's just on my mind.
Katrina, go for it.
Just a quick question. I think maybe for both of you. I think some vocabulary that Gabriela mentioned at the end was this idea of decentering, and the word operationalizing kind of started coming up very strongly. So I wonder if you can expand a bit on, how are you framing or understanding that, and how that impacts concretely the work you do?
Tanzi, if you want to go first, I'm happy to let you go first, or whichever order. So you tell me. Catalina, should I go because you mentioned me?
Yes, please do, while Tanzil thinks about it.
Okay. So operationalizing, I think probably it reflects a little bit what everyone in this area who's been doing this work feels after a number of decades, which is this kind of exhaustion at speaking to ourselves. And so really pushing to what does it mean that we've done all of this work. And there is meaning to the work of exposing, as I noted, but operationalizing really does require both proposition and politics. And just building off actually the Soraya had mentioned the occupations as an example in her comparison. I'm actually also doing work on high-rise occupations in Sao Paulo, and an example of what I mean by operationalizing and the issues that come to the fore reminds me of a meeting where the city council of Sao Paulo essentially gave the mandate to a group of researchers, much like ourselves, to examine high-rise occupations in the city, to do a survey, to understand needs of folks who are living in occupations and how they are securing those needs. And there was a colleague present at this meeting who's been around perhaps a few more decades and working alongside different community members, who really was egging on the researchers and saying, here, I wrote a book about this 20 years ago. Or here, you could have looked at this. So what is it? What new things have we learned? And I think the urgency of operationalizing really comes from this sense of, we actually do have a pretty common ground across us, comparatively, locally, in terms of what we think is right? What is justice? What does it look like? And it surrounds these ideas of justice in terms of the ways I was talking about before, in terms of epistemic justice and all of the words that we've been using in this group and outside of this group. So what does it mean to really translate things? And at first I thought my senior colleague was perhaps being a bit wily and annoyed because they're more senior and they've seen this kind of thing. And I felt bad for the young researchers, who had been mandated by the city to do this survey. But in effect, what she was calling for was a political movement. And for me, that's what the latest frontier really requires in terms of action research. So we know, again, how to expose. We're good at proposition. Engaging with the politicizing is a much longer march. And it's harder to do because the institutions within which we exist require a different time scale. Capitalism moves much faster than we do as researchers. And I think this speaks to Tanzil, your point about being in but not of, for example, the academic institutions in which we live. But operationalizing means politicizing and working to see material changes, experiential changes on the ground. And I'll be quiet now. Thank you, Catalina, for the question.
That was great, Gabriela. Thanks for catching it. It's such a wonderful prompt. Tanzil, do you want to maybe discuss some parts of your how you see operationalization?
Yeah, I think Gabriela just put the nail on its head. Precisely, I think there has been, I was just in a conference the other day, and then someone was mentioning that what's new, a lot of these things, this was in the 70s and 80s, we talked about all of this, participatory action research and stuff like that. And so I think there is a particular moment now that that a lot of these values that we see are already driving a lot of us already. But I like this idea that I couldn't understand who the first question, who was it? But this idea that it's almost like we do these things in pockets and we repeat a lot of the things that others are doing because we're not particularly aware of, so I feel like building, this solidarities across researchers who are like-minded and who would actually love to learn from each other through a more informal means, not that I have to write about my experience and after 3 years it's going to come out as a journal article and then someone else learns from it. So I think having a collective learning infrastructure from each other, those things are quite crucial. So I'm just furthering the point that was made by Gabriela, this, how do we, if we are in these institutions and we need to be in them to pay our bills and send my daughter to expensive daycare, because I don't have access to public funds because I'm on a visa and not a citizen. But you get the point that we do need to be in these institutions, but how can we transcend and how can we create spaces, I mean, which I see, so Jono, you came to the group that I run here, the Southern Theorizing Group. So we see ourselves as in Sheffield, but not off the university, right? So, creating these transitional spaces, and they may be temporary. That's okay. I mean, I think it's not about institutionalizing and formalizing it, but how do we bring these very different actors together? I think that's the first step, because traditionally, I think 10, 20 years ago, you'd have like, one professor establishing a research center and, threatening the university that, that they can move their entire research center to another place if he doesn't think, if things don't happen his way. So, I mean, I'm not going to name names, but, you have examples of formidable professors taking his entire center, moving from, let's say, Harvard to Chicago, right? So the point being, I think this is not a way to operationalize anymore. I mean, I think, how do we build a collective infrastructure, a horizontal network? This is key. So it's and someone, I think, needs to really play that the role of, I mean, if you're using in this sort of like a Deleuzian language, I mean, someone needs to construct that assemblage. Someone needs to be an intercessor. Someone needs to, put in more effort than others to set this up. So I feel like that's the work under for the footsteps of that infrastructure being generated, because I think it's already in the calling. I mean, it's already, you can see that there are so many people doing similar things. This talk of decentering is so much related to the notion of departitioning. It's all of these actions, but again, if I'm just tied to sort of say in Bangladesh because I'm from there, I remain local, and that local has no purchase in a global scale, except however much I can push. But if there is all this local things coming together from across the many souths and many easts, that has purchase and that has a political voice. And I think we need to really work towards establishing those sorts of lateral infrastructures. And that's what I think we already can do. The university is not stopping us. The university didn't stop me from starting the Southern Theorizing Group, from inviting everyone and, to keep doing it. So I think, it's really on us. I mean, we cannot keep blaming the institutions that we work for. So, I mean, that would be my 2 cents. I don't know if this is making any sense. I mean, yeah.
That's great. We can't see, but we're taking down notes on the Miro board. So we picked up a few of these interesting points about like local in mind, not in place. So you have lateral infrastructures, kind of like the sort of discussion over time. I mean, from Gabriela, his ideas of, comparison for whom, operationalizing these ideas, where do we start? So if anyone wants to sort of, it's got a longish day, we do have a bunch of footnotes on here. And Katrina, in a few minutes, will take us through a wonderful reflection on the day. But before she does that, I mean, Tansi, thank you. That was really great. Are there any from the floor? I mean, we have more than 50 people on live. I'm sure somebody's got some. Cool. So we have Lasejo Bansanga.
It's okay.
There you go for it.
Okay. Yeah, I guess my question is about, sometimes the second speaker in the first session, I mean, spoke about, blurring that boundary between practice and analytical work. And this also I was wondering, sometimes academia is just like the space and quite radically, and it's often times why we lead on to that, but in practice, there are a lot more like systemic limitations in terms of like how some of these radical ideas can then be like explored. And in some ways, I find that, you kind of have to tread carefully between doing certain kinds of work and then putting, I guess, the sorts of people in that space at risk. And so how do some of the speakers, you know, when you're doing work regarding occupations, like how has, on the one side, the work that you've done put communities at risk? And if it has, and then like, how do you then subvert that to then inform like better practice in working with like those kinds of communities? Because that is the risk of doing that kind of work. Not to say it needs not to be done, but yeah, what are the modes of care and treading carefully do people put in place to make sure that that doesn't happen, or even if it happens, like that it's still, you know, confined to still a safe space?
Great. Does one of the speakers want to respond to that? Did you hear it? Would you like us to paraphrase?
I'm happy.
So
I'm happy
speakers.
to try in a little way. Just
Sorry,
to say, can you hear me? Okay.
I got the speaker as this one. Can you just check you can hear us?
Yes, we can hear you. Gabriela is trying to talk as well.
Okay. Okay. I was just going to say very briefly, you know, one of the most important things is to be invited. We don't, and that's part of what CAR is about, right? Like we have our own ideas and our own research agendas, but how flexible are we to shift when we need to shift, and how flexible are we to refrain from exposing when exposing engenders vulnerabilities that we don't wish to pursue. You know, being very aware of that is our job, in effect. If we can't do that, then, you know, don't do this work. So it's you know, often within my department, we have periodically had discussions of, you know, putting forth a kind of manifesto of ethics in the way, much in the way that medical doctors, you know, take the Hippocratic Oath, what is our oath? And that is centered in the classes, and I know Bea and Catalina and Sanziel and all of us have engaged with those discussions in our own classes and in our own research. But it's a painful awareness, and it is a struggle because, as you know, the work we do does not always translate into things that are published, let's say, for an academic audience, or published in a manner that reflects the quote unquote standards of robustness that require that you reveal your sources. Okay, so if you require a certain amount of information or non-anonymity, then I can't publish there. So I think it's that awareness, Lubaina, which is really critical.
But is there also another, and I guess the flips happen, like, because surely they do, and the ethics before, but do you then go back and reflect like, oh, this happened and actually, yeah, like it had these effects, which might have been negative?
Yes, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, reflection is a core part of what we do, and we're constantly shifting and, you know, reacting and adapting. And so, you know, one of the ways that I deal with this, very frankly, in my own practice, even within research that is in cooperation with the occupations of these high-rise buildings in Sao Paulo, is actually to center the work on where I at least see some seats of power, and that again is with the level of a utility, whether it be an energy company or a water and sanitation company, and trying to understand their rationales and trying to convince them through the research that a logic of equity makes more sense for them as well, to make it essentially easy for them to adapt and adopt equity, as opposed to using exposure of communities as a method. Does that make sense? So I try not to expose at the community level. I learn from communities. I like to work with communities that invite me to work with them, because, for example, yesterday, the police essentially kicked out residents from one of the occupied buildings we're working with in Sao Paulo. And people are really desperate for attention and help. What can we, that's where I want to be. I want to make my research service to them. And it's not about publishing their names or creating vulnerabilities that don't exist already, but really working to expose those vulnerabilities within the seats of power that exist and make them accountable.
Yeah, I think your work, yeah, please, yeah, I think you definitely, this speaks to what you were discussing today.
I'll just add on. I mean, again, I think spot on. This whole idea of being invited. I mean, this is absolutely crucial. I can only say that, like, for example, in my work, I literally spent 1 month doing nothing in the first 1 month with the community. I just went every day and I just sat. I shared my life. I shared. If I had to ask someone really the details about their lives, then I had to share my own. So the first 1 month, it went to the point where one evening, actually, one of the community leaders called me and asked me, what about the research that you said that you want to do? Like, can you start it now? And then they are the ones who introduced it to the community. Literally, they're like, you don't know how to talk to these people. Let me introduce your project. And there was like, okay, I'm like, okay. And then I just took a step back. And all of that, it was difficult to, let's say, portray it in the methodology. It's like, okay, there is no name for this. It's like, what do you do? How do you say that out of 6 months field work, you're going to spend 1 month doing nothing? So of course, there is that aspect that you need to negotiate how you're going to talk about it to get through administrative loopholes. So there is that aspect. But the other question, the very rightly the question that you asked, I don't think there is it's almost like this. And one of the major idea of Hippocratic Oath is that when doctors, you try to save lives, but that's not the case every time. There are moments in which you have to choose between two lives. My mom is a gynecologist, so I have heard stories where she had to make the very, very impossible decision of either saving the mom or the child. The point being, I don't think it's so easy to say, to pinpoint exactly, like you'll have like an ethical guidebook, and then you go to a situation, you refer to page 17, article 3, and then you are like, oh, done. It's not going to work like that. I think we owe it to ourselves as ethical practitioners and researchers to understand what harm are we doing by either naming a person or not naming. So for example, I have reviewed papers in which they have kept everything anonymous, but the level of detail that's written about them, I can easily go and find out that person. I don't know the name, but I know intricate details of it in the paper. So that person can say that ethically he did not expose them, or he did not put their name, it's anonymous, but there is level of detail which exposes them. So I think this needs to be in consultation with the very people that so it's the same idea of informed consent in some way, that sometimes the communities do want recognition. They want their name on paper. Right now I am co-authoring a paper with one of the local leaders, and he has not even graduated middle school, like not even high school, but he is very happy that he is co-authoring a paper with me. He wants his name, he wants to put it there, he wants that archiving of his actions through the research paper. So does this expose him to the local people, to the local mafia and stuff like that? But that was his choice. He's asking to be named. So it's not upon me at that point to judge his decision. So I think taking ourselves out from this high pedestal of deciding all ethical matters by ourselves because of our superior intellect, I think we need to relegate that responsibility. We need to devolve it. It needs to come as a consensual ethically driven process by which you come and you decide together, and then you discuss, and then you decide how far you want to expose, how far you don't want, and being open to many options. I think that is key, to be flexible. I mean, the great Southern thing is absolute flexibility. If there is ever anything particularly Southern, I think that's it. But anyway, that's my 2 cents again. I've been giving a lot of sense.
No, we appreciate all your senses and other brands and I think very much, yeah. I think that's if I can speak in mental health. I think when she was talking about repair as an iterative practice, repair as thinking about slower, longer engagements, I think Tansy, what you're talking about there makes me think about what Soraya was sharing, that maybe consent and ethics is not a once-off, it's a constant, and that's what some of you were describing, is like you're constantly going back to this leader, to this resident, saying, this is what this is, now what, and I guess like ideas of, more contemporary ideas of consent, it's not always a given. Like, just because it was given once doesn't mean that it's always there. And I think that's a really nice way to connect what Soraya was sharing and what you're saying is that perhaps these Southern values that maybe are not explicit Southern values, but we could sort of maybe put them forward as something to be a perspective to say perhaps that's an ideal value that we could take from this group, is that a revisitation, a renegotiation, a reconceptualization, and then we can make up words. Yeah, I read made up words earlier on, so I think I can do it too. But I really like that, and I think it ties a little bit to what, but perhaps someone else can maybe, because Scott's not here, it'd be nice to sort of bring any reflections from her presentation into what some of the speakers said. Does anyone else have any?
So coming back to vulnerability before I launch into connecting to science, it's absolutely right that we're talking about vulnerabilities with the people that are involved and affected by the work that we do in the context that we research and we practice. But I think there's also how to be a vulnerable researcher, how to do work that is vulnerable, how to do work that can change. You can change the situation, the context that you're in can change the ideology. To be able to kind of practice from the heart and kind of flexibly kind of justify it later, or to hope that you can find the collective support. And so the Soraya's vocabularies included defined endurance. I know she meant that in terms of the resonance of that housing block, but how to be definedly enduring as a researcher, and when she also talked about infrastructure repair, and I guess having groups like this, having this kind of community, is for me a way of kind of vulnerability safety net, kind of a chance to build solidarities, to kind of share those multiple possibilities, different ways of kind of being able to be flexible, to let things happen, to be able to ethically keep going with the flow, but with your values. So there's also that bit of repairing infrastructure in a sense, in terms of human infrastructure, in terms of connections with people.
So we've got 2 minutes for anyone who'd like to get a last comment in or reflection point.
Anyone else here?
And second.
There's nobody on mute as well.